All right, well, we've sort of walked through the first three of our evidences: time, life, mind, ought, or actually rather just time, life, mind. Now we'll be looking at ought. And I'm tempted to do a review, but what I'm going to do is not review, just press on right into our fourth line of evidence, our fourth theme. And then what we'll do after we've gone through ought and friend, we'll have sort of a, I hate to use the word comprehensive, but we'll just go back through it all, quickly review. I'll give you a verbal quiz, so to speak, asking you the questions. You can respond, and then we'll wrap up our apologetics class. So without review, let's press on into our fourth line of evidence here, and it is represented or summarized by the word ought. What's the word, everyone? Ought. And so you have a packet there in front of you, and you'll notice it says theme 4. What does it say? To ought or not. To ought or not. And two verses here right at the outset. The first is Leviticus chapter 11, verse 45. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 45 from the English Standard Version. The Bible says, read it with me if you would, "You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." Okay? Very good. In other words, the basis of your holiness will be my holiness. You will be holy. You can take the word "for" there and substitute the word "because." Right? You shall therefore be holy because I am holy. Right? I am your father, you are my children, I am holy, and therefore my expectation of you is also holiness. And then Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, Jesus gives us here what he said is the distillation of the entire Old Testament. This is to say, this is the essence of the entire Old Testament. I love to ask people that question. If you could distill the entire Old Testament down to a single idea, to a single concept, what would that be? And you hear a variety of answers. You hear the Messiah, you hear justice, you hear law, you hear love, you hear all of these different things, the revelation of God. And all of those things are elements of the truth. But look at what Jesus himself said was the very essence of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. Let's read it together. Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets." Isn't that a fascinating summary of the Old Testament? Jesus basically says that the essence, the basic thrust of the Old Testament is to treat others as you would want to be what? Treated. And as we said yesterday, the New Testament is an inspired commentary on the Old Testament. So we better be very careful that we don't understand the Old Testament in a way different from the way that Jesus understood it. Jesus here, as more than just an inspired commentator, but certainly as the Son of God, is telling us the essence of the Old Testament is love. Right? Isn't that right? To do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Isn't that the rock bottom principle of love? 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 5, "Love seeketh not its own. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends." And so Jesus here is basically telling us that the essence, the fundament of the Old Testament is to love others. And so we're going to be talking about the subject of morality. What's the subject, everyone? Morality. And our first subheading is mooring morality. Now, who, apart from Adrian, wants to tell me what it means to moor something? Okay, Ron, what is it? That's right, to anchor it. So the question is, to what do we anchor morality? Mooring morality. Where are we going to put our moral roots? Where do they go? Do they go in culture? Do our moral roots go in preference? Or is there some other larger, grander, transcendent mooring place for morality? To paraphrase Scottish philosopher David Hume, you cannot get an ought from an is. You cannot get an ought from an is. In other words, is describes what is, obviously. It's what exists. It is descriptive, okay? You cannot get an ought from what? From an is. Okay. Is describes the state of things as they are. Okay? We call this descriptive. Ought describes the state, the state of things that should be. Okay? and we would call this prescriptive. Right? A doctor gives a prescription. In other words, this is what you should do. And what Hume says here, and many others have paraphrased him and sort of grabbed onto this and put their own spin on it. But basically what's being communicated is that you cannot get a prescriptive truth from a descriptive truth. Is simply tells you the state of things as they are. Ought tells you how they should be. Does that make sense? And so you cannot get an ought from an is. You cannot get an ought from an is. Now let's talk about that word ought. The word ought has moral implications. What kinds of implications? Moral implications. Okay? And those moral implications include ideas such as duty and what's the other word there? Responsibility. Okay, responsibility. Okay, so we could say something is a certain way. Okay, we could describe any state of affairs and say it is this way, but ought is different. If we're describing a state of affairs and we say it ought to be, do you see the difference? So this is exactly the point, that it is difficult, impossible I would say, to derive an absolute is, or pardon me, an absolute ought from simply an is. We can describe the state of affairs, but there's a difference between describing and prescribing. Okay? And there are many stories in Scripture, and we talked about this briefly, I think maybe in our How to Study the Bible class, but there are many stories in Scripture that are misunderstood even by sincere students of Scripture because they fail to understand the distinction between a story that is merely descriptive and a story that is what? Prescriptive. Okay, so what would be some examples of descriptive stories in Scripture that are simply describing, but certainly not prescribing behavior? Martin. Okay, that's a classic example. David with Bathsheba. Can you think of some others? Okay, Saul with the witch of Endor. Very, very good. Anyone else? Abraham with Hagar. Definitely descriptive rather than prescriptive. How about the story of the Garden of Eden? Certainly, or the nakedness of Noah, or the denial of Jesus by Peter. These are descriptive stories. The Bible is not advocating this behavior. And you'll recall that marvelous statement there from the pen of Ellen White where she says basically that the fact that the Bible contains these somewhat embarrassing anecdotes and stories about some of its chiefest characters strongly suggests that the Bible is an authentic revelation of those events. Human histories tend to be very biased. Human histories tend to put things either in a flattering or not flattering light. In fact, it's impossible for human histories to be completely unbiased. But the fact that Scripture says that David was a man after God's own heart, but then records these rather humiliating and ignominious things about him, strongly suggests that the Bible is what it claims to be, a divine revelation not just from man's perspective, but what? From God's perspective. So as Bible students, we need to distinguish between stories that are simply descriptive and then stories that are also prescriptive. What would be some examples of prescriptive stories? Okay, Daniel praying, very good. There in Daniel chapter 6, refusing to submit himself, his prayer life to the king. He prays, he ends up in the lion's den. Very good. That's also descriptive, by the way. That is an actual historical event, but it's largely a prescriptive story, probably recorded for that purpose. Okay, what's another one? Peter before the Pharisee. That's a very good one. I heard what? What aspect of Joseph's life? Okay, Potiphar. Hey, that's a good one. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, when he flees, very good. Okay, what'd you say, Josh? You said that one, okay? Okay, Abraham being willing to leave the Ur of the Chaldees. Very good. So the Bible is filled with both prescriptive and descriptive stories. Now, having said that, not just in terms of biblical stories, but if we're going to talk about mooring morality, if we're going to talk about where are we going to anchor morality, and we'll see here in just a bit that there are some different places to anchor morality. We can anchor morality in culture. We can anchor morality in personal preference. We can anchor morality in a variety of different places. What we're going to argue for here is that the very best anchor for morality, absolute morality, in fact the only, is a transcendent anchor, and that is God Himself, okay? So where are we going to anchor morality? Okay? Let's continue on here. It says, so are there things a person ought to do? What do you think the answer to that question is? Yeah, I think so. I think so. Are there things that a person ought to do? It says here, in other words, is there such a thing as morality? Morality. Most people, of course, answer this question in the affirmative, but what then is the basis for morality? And that's what we're talking about here. Where are we going to root our moral compunctions? Where are we going to root our oughtness as we view the world? Where are we going to put that? From where does it grow? From where does it come? The answer to this question, perhaps more than any of the previous themes, time, life, or mind, highlights the difference between a theistic universe and a strictly materialistic one. In short, an absolute objective morality could not exist in a strictly materialistic universe. Okay, you might want to underline that last part there. It says, in short, an absolute objective morality could not exist in a strictly materialistic universe. And the reason why should be absolutely clear to every person in this class. Okay, so here we have materialism. What are some of the other names, by the way, that we've talked about? Naturalism is one. Secularism, kind of. Okay. No, okay. You got one there, Brandon. Now you're just shooting from the hip. Naturalism. Okay. Then reductionism. We've also used the term physicalism. Okay. These are basically describing the same idea. And this idea is what? That reality is fundamentally physical, and those two physical constituent elements are matter and energy. And I believe yesterday we saw persuasively, at least from my perspective, it's utterly persuasive, the absurdity and the foolishness of this particular perspective when it comes to try and explain something that we all take for granted like mind, the subjective nature of experience. And not just the mind in general, but the fact that the mind is here to grasp such an amazing universe. And we tried to say, how can matter and energy account for the mind? And the answer is what? It can't. Can it account for a brain? Yeah, it can. Theoretically, it can account for a brain because a brain is a material organ, a physical organ that exists within the skull. So yeah, we can get a brain here, theoretically, but the question we asked yesterday is, at what point does matter become conscious of itself, and how is that possible? Right? Remember we talked about the emergent property. If you have a line there and you can go all the way down to a very sophisticated geometrical figure here, and every point along the continuum, what do you have? A geometrical figure. But if we start with a very simple neuronal structure, brain-like structure, and we advance to a very complex brain-like structure, for example, the human brain, at every place along the continuum, we have a very complex assemblage of nerve cells, neurons. But here, what emerges? What's the emergent property? Consciousness. And you can see that consciousness is substantively different than neurons. Consciousness is immaterial. Neurons are definitionally or obviously material. And so I think we pointed out yesterday, persuasive to me, perhaps to you, I hope so, and I think we all find it persuasive intuitively. Only people who are absolutely committed to materialism would be unpersuaded. Remember that quotation there? You know, it never ceases to amaze me, even though I know it's true, that all of the richness of my private mental life is simply the result of little specks of jelly in my head. Come on, you don't believe that. You don't believe that. And please don't tell your wife that. Your marriage won't last very long, right? Sweetie, the jelly in my head loves the jelly. No, that's not the case. So we basically pointed out, I believe, yesterday, at least to my satisfaction, the materialist worldview is falsified by the existence of the mind, okay? But now think about morality. How would we encourage matter to do what it ought to do? How would we encourage carbon or hydrogen or helium or nitrogen to do the right thing? Are you tracking with me? Matter does what matter must do when subjected to the laws of physics. It doesn't have a will, and it cannot rebel against the laws that will necessarily make it behave in a certain way. Making sense? So the question is how would you anchor morality in a strictly materialistic world? To what would you anchor it? Yeah, you can begin to see that if morality actually exists, okay, if it's not just a concept in the mind, if morality, moral behavior actually exists, how much would morality weigh? What are the measurements of morality? Length, width, depth. Yeah, you're all kind of smirking. You're all kind of smiling. The answer is, well, morality doesn't weigh anything. A moral concept cannot be measured. Well, wait a minute. If it's not made of either matter or energy, then does it exist as an abstract, immaterial entity in this universe? No. What would it be made of? Right? We're back to our red houses in Norway. Right? What would it be made of? And so that's why we say here, read it again. In short, an absolute objective morality could not exist in a strictly materialistic universe. Now, could morality exist in a strictly materialistic universe? Yes, sure. Morality could exist so long as you had creatures that possessed volition and preference, but notice the two words here, absolute, objective. Now that should be making very good sense to us. What would the word absolute mean in this context? What's that, Jared? Yeah, it would mean universal. That's right. In other words, it would apply to everyone. Absolute. It would be immutable. That is to say, it stands independent of someone's assent to it. It's absolute. Okay? Well, if we define morality simply as what I prefer to do, right? And let's just say that a materialist universe has in fact produced beings like me and beings like you that have volition and have intentionality. I might say that I prefer the nurturing of children to the torturing of children. That is a morality, but it's not an absolute morality. You might disagree. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit, subjectivism and relativism. What's the other word here? Absolute and objective. Okay, there we go. Now, remember, this should just jump off the page here, or off the whiteboard, so to speak. What were the two kinds of truth that we talked about there? We have not followed cunningly devised fables. Truth, subjective and objective. Now, someone encourage me here and tell me, what's the basic difference between subjective truth and objective truth? Okay, that's very good, Linz. That subjective sort of has the feelings, objective not as much. But fundamentally, what do these words signify, subjective and objective? That's right, the locus of truth. Is that what you're going to say, Anthony? The locus of truth here is with the subject. The locus of truth, by the way, we use the word locus, it just means place, as in location. Okay, so the location of truth here is in the subject. The location of truth here is in the object. So let's go back over here to morality. If we're saying that morality is objective, we're saying that the truthfulness of morality is not based in my assent or dissent from that. It's based in the morality itself. Are you tracking with that? So could you have some kind of quasi-personal cultural morality in this system? Sure, as long as you conceded that this system could get you volitional moral beings, which I think is highly doubtful, but let's just say it could. Obviously, many materialists believe that. But even if you can get a person, right? Even if you can get a person out of this universe, which let's just say for the sake of argument that you could, how do you determine whose moral system? Should we use Ed's moral system or should we use Ned's moral system? Okay? How would you go about? Can Ned have a moral, can he see things that ought to be one way from his perspective and ought not to be, sure he can. And how about Ed? Yeah, absolutely. But how would you go about competing or deciding between these two? Well, you wouldn't. You couldn't. Because you wouldn't have an absolute objective. You would have a variant subjective morality. Okay? Now, we're just getting slightly ahead of ourselves, but this sort of gives us a picture of where we're headed. Now, you can actually make, I believe, a very persuasive argument for the existence of God from this very thing, and it's right there in your packet. Take a look at it. Major premise is this: if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Okay, that's your major premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And you substantiate that major premise by saying, to what would you root, to what would you moor, that's the word we're talking about, mooring morality, to what would you moor morality in order to give you absolute value, absolute moral truth for everyone, both Ted and Ned and every other person? Okay? And the answer is, if it's anything other than something that is outside of human experience, it's not absolute and invariant. Make sense? So our major premise, I believe, is supportable. And that is that if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Now, if you strike the word objective, that sentence is not the case. In other words, if you just struck the word objective, if it just said, if God does not exist, moral values do not exist, is that true? No, that would not be true. But the moment we insert the word objective, or you could also insert the word absolute, the moment you insert that word, basically what you're saying is, to what else would you moor morality, absolute morality, if not God, if not something that is transcendent to the human experience? Okay? I see a couple hands here. Joshua.
I'm just wondering, in a strictly materialistic universe,
Mm-hmm.
how can any moral value exist? Because it's an immaterial thing, a value, like a moral value by itself is not a material.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate question. The answer would probably be that it exists in the same way that anything exists, the same way that thoughts exist. It would be a mystery, but as long as there's a person there to advocate that particular perspective, then it appears to have an existence. Not an absolute existence, but a personal existence.
But weren't things like thoughts and values evidences that there is no such thing as a strictly materialistic?
Yeah, if I think that it might be clear if instead of thinking of morality in a materialistic universe, think of them as preferences. Preferences.
Which is still derived from thought, which is immaterial.
Yeah, listen, I totally agree, which is why we kind of said there, could this world actually give us persons? Probably not, but let's grant that. Let's grant a number of assumptions to get us to this point and then ask the question, what would an absolute objective morality be rooted in? Making sense? In other words, we're granting a whole host of assumptions just to get us to this point. I believe, as you believe, that the fool has said in his heart there is no God. So I don't believe that, I think we're conceding a lot when we basically let somebody say, okay, well, you believe in materialism and you're here, and I believe in immaterialism and I'm here, but let's just say that your worldview is true. That's granting a lot. But we're being very gracious in our, if we didn't grant that, and we have to remember that the people that we're interacting with believe this. Many people believe this. So we have to meet them where they're at. We may know that philosophically and rationally, it's very difficult to even make a case for the existence of the mind in a strictly materialistic universe. But if you've not yet covered that ground with someone, you have to meet them where they are, and they may. There's lots of people in the world, for example, that disbelieve God, but believe that unjustified killing is wrong. So what we're going to try and do is show them the illogic of that position. Making sense? So what you're saying strictly philosophically, I completely concur. But let's make a series of concessions to get to the place where we can dialogue with the people. Great question. Anthony?
Wouldn't morality just be determined then?
Determined by? Oh, you're going back to determinism. Yeah, I had several questions yesterday about determinism. Who was that was asking those questions? I think it was you, Caitlin. Did you come and talk to me about determinism? Yeah, you need to understand when we talk about determinism, there are really two kinds of determinism. There are more, but for our purposes in this class, you have genetic determinism, which is basically what you get from your parents. Your personality is determined genetically. And then you have what we talked about yesterday, physical determinism. Everything that is physical is subject to the various laws of physics, and therefore you have no free will. So you have genetic determinists, and you have physical determinists. And in answer to Anthony's question, if we live in a strictly materialist universe, wouldn't morality be determined? Yes, everything would be determined, I believe. It's inescapable, from my perspective, to interject any kind of soul or will or spirit or free will into a conversation if all we're dealing with is strictly material entities. So I agree, but that's a question very similar to the one that Joshua was asking. Totally, but we have to interact with people who believe they have free will, right? Who believe that they are actual persons that possess identity, personality, volition, but who also deny God, right? So we have to meet these people where they're at. You and I are beginning to see, and I love these questions, by the way. These questions are just exactly the kinds of questions that you should be asking, given what we've learned. Amen? Does that make sense? You see? In other words, you're beginning to say, but wait a minute, that's not rational. Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. If they believe that, wouldn't that just be determined by them? But wait a minute, how can they believe that? Because morality is not made of exactly. So what we're beginning to see, what you're beginning to hopefully see, what obviously some are, is the folly of trying to maintain life as we know it right? As we live it, as we know it, as we love it, which basically everyone does, but then deny the existence of God that has given that life. There's actually a very powerful apologetic argument based on this very thing that we don't have time to go into in this class, and it's not easily grasped, but I guarantee that many of you could grasp it. It's called the Transcendental argument for the existence of God. The Transcendental argument for the existence of God. And if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to get you some material that you will find fascinating. Basically what it says is that you can't even begin a rational discussion without any rational inference, the laws of logic, a rational discussion, without first justifying a universe in which rationality is possible. Make sense? So what a transcendentalist will do is he won't even get into, I'm kind of what you would call what's the term they use there? An evidentialist. In other words, I kind of basically say, let's go look at the evidence. Let's look at the evidence. What best squares with a theistic, what best squares with what we see around us? Theistic or not theistic? Let's look at the issue of time. Theistic. What best squares with the evidence that we see around us in terms of life, the origin of life, the maintenance of life? Theistic or non-theistic? Theistic. Let's look at the evidence, the existence of the mind. What best squares with the evidence? So you see what we've tried to do in here is present some evidence. Some what, everyone? Evidence. But you need to understand there's a whole other school of apologetic thought that basically says, whoa, 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 slow down. You've conceded too much. They would say to me. They would say, you know, we love your class, David, and we love what you've presented. The problem is that you've conceded too much to the unbeliever. Why even allow them to meet you on the grounds of rationality? You can justify rational inference because you have a universe that is orderly, that is given to the principles of order and logic and rationality. In other words, rationality, order, and logic are all rooted in the character of God, okay? But the atheist, before he should be allowed or she should be allowed to engage with you rationally, let them justify that rationality is even possible in their universe. You follow? So transcendentalists often don't even get into evidentiary arguments because they basically say, why even get into the evidentiary arguments? Their universe can't even justify rational inference, logical thought, the propositional laws of logic. So make them first justify that. Once they've justified that, which they say is not possible, how can you infer rationality from matter and energy? How can you infer a universe that is conducive to the propositional laws of logic from matter and energy? Remember the quote from Einstein yesterday? Remember the quote from Einstein? Some of you will have it right in front of you. Just flip back. Flip back. This will help. Flip back to the quote. It will be under the mind section. When somebody's found it, I'll just read it from your page. It will be under the mind section. And it will be when Einstein says, you consider it a mystery. You consider it, here it is. It's on page, right. It's on the last page of the mind section. Okay, now listen to what he says here. Listen to what he says. We all there? You find it strange? We read this yesterday, but this should really resonate, right, with what we're talking about. You find it strange that I consider the comprehensibility of the world to the extent that we are authorized to speak of such a comprehensibility as a miracle or an eternal mystery. In other words, he says, you find it strange that I consider it a miracle or a mystery that the universe is rational. Right? That the universe makes sense. Look at what he goes on to say. Well, a priori, that is to say, before, if we just came to a materialist universe, if we just came to the universe and didn't know there was a God, what would we expect? We would expect what kind of a world? A chaotic world which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. Let me tell you what he's saying. If something cannot be grasped by the mind, it's irrational. You see what he's saying? He's basically saying that we would expect a universe that could not be grasped by the mind in any way. The kind of order created by Newton's theory of gravitation, right? We talked about physics yesterday, for example, is totally different. Even if a man proposes the axioms of the theory, the success of such a project presupposes a high degree of what? Notice, even for Newton to even begin his investigation, he's presupposing a high degree of ordering of the material world. Remember what we said yesterday? Physicists don't make up the laws of physics. What do? They discover them, which means they were there before they were known. Okay, so what he goes on to say is a high degree of ordering of the objective world. This could not be expected a priori. In other words, we wouldn't expect the world to be so rational, to be so linear, to be so logical, the universe, I mean. That is the miracle which is being constantly reinforced as our knowledge expands. Okay, do you see what he's saying? He's basically saying we cannot explain the rationality of the universe. A priori, we shouldn't expect that. And Einstein says it's a miracle. It's a miracle. So, now, watch. What the Transcendentalist says, and the questions that Anthony and Joshua have asked are very much in keeping with Transcendental apologetics, basically say, listen, Mr. Atheist, listen, Mr. Skeptic, listen, Mr. Doubter, I'm not even going to engage with the evidence until you show me that your worldview can support rationality.
Do they ever get into conversations with anybody?
Who?
These transcendentalists?
Oh, they absolutely destroy the atheists in the debates.
Like, how can an atheist even support that?
They try to show that logic derives from matter and energy, and they fail. In fact, if you want to listen to the classic example of a transcendentalist wiping the floor with an atheist, you want to listen to the debate between Dr. Greg Bahnsen. I'm almost sure you can find this on YouTube. It's Bahnsen, and Dr. Gordon Stein. Bahnsen is the transcendentalist. Okay? I'm almost sure you can find that online. If you can't, I own it. And you can come and talk to me, but I would be 99.9% sure you'll find that online. If you want to get a feel for the strength of transcendental apologetics and how the atheists just go, listen to that debate. There are so many fascinating exchanges in that debate that, in fact, maybe during the break, I'll go find one of my favorite exchanges and just play it for you. But Dr. Greg Bahnsen, unfortunately, I think he was killed in a car accident, if I'm not mistaken. He died, I think, in 1995, 1996. He was probably the single best known and maybe the single best modern exponent, or not exponent, but proponent of transcendental apologetics. And he wouldn't get into almost anything that we're talking about here, okay? Because he would basically say to the atheist, justify rationality. Okay? Once you've justified rationality, then we'll have a discussion. But the fact that you're trying to debate with me proves that you believe in rational inference, you believe in the laws of logic, you believe in deduction. But the problem is your universe doesn't seem to support it. My universe supports it. So the fact that we're even having a debate tonight proves that my universe is the one that's most consistent with the universe in which we find ourselves, my perspective. Making sense, everyone? And by the way, I agree with much of that. And many of you I know are understanding exactly what I've just said. You're getting it. You understand that. You really get the concept that it's very difficult to support, to show that rationality can somehow emerge from matter and energy. You understand it. But what you need to understand is that 95% of the people that you'll interact with, you will not interact with at that level. Most people will say, really, what I consider to be irrational things, like, I believe that unjustified killing is wrong, but I don't believe in God. Okay? Well, if you take them through the transcendental argument, they're going to go, think of how many hours it's taken us to get to the place where you're now understanding these things. So what you're going to have to do is make a host of concessions, right? A host of concessions so that you can get to the whole conversation about Ed's morality versus Ned's morality. Does this make sense, everyone? In other words, you are conceding a great deal even to enter into this particular discussion, but at least you know it. At least you know it. Okay, making sense? Great. And I'll recommend a book. I'll put it in the bibliography. It's called Always Be Ready. That's by Dr. Greg Bahnsen, which is probably the clearest or the most succinct articulation of the transcendental apologetic that I'm personally aware of. This was really launched and not launched is maybe the wrong word, but the greatest known advocate, he's passed away now, of the transcendental apologetics was a man named Cornelius Van Til. But some of his stuff can be most of his stuff is exceedingly difficult to read and for many even understand. But Bahnsen does a very good job of distilling the strength of his argument down, making it accessible. And what I'd recommend you do is just listen to that debate between Dr. Greg Bahnsen and Dr. Gordon Stein, and you'll have a real feel for the transcendental argument and how it's employed. Okay? So back to the question of morality. There were some hands up there before we sort of got off on that very important and helpful tangent, but I want to get those hands. It was you, wasn't it, Leah?
Yeah, but mine might be a bit of a long question. Basically, like, when I was looking at this argument of God existing...
Back to the argument, yes.
Because the idea of objective moral values, is that a consensus? Like, does everybody agree that there are objective moral values? Because I'm sure there are people that would say there aren't such a...
Okay, great question.
How do we prove it?
Okay.
Because we know that's true.
Great question. What Leah's saying is, I have questions about your minor premise, right? Major premise is, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Minor premise is, objective moral values do exist. And Leah's saying, how do we prove that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. That's the whole, basically, I'm just telling you what the argument is up front, and then I'll try and justify it. Okay? Russ.
Also that Bonson wrote a book where he actually talked about, he actually went in depth on a lot of Van Til's positions and stuff.
Oh yeah, it's good that you know that. Yeah, Bonson was really quite a neat guy, really an amazing guy. I really liked him. He was a little cocky sometimes in his debates, but I really liked him, and I liked the way he carried himself. Some of his theology, his covenantal theology, I really wrestled with, of course. He's obviously not obviously, but he's a Presbyterian, Reform actually. So some of his theology I was sort of iffy about, but yeah, as far as being an excellent defender and communicator of the Christian worldview, fantastic. I mean, to me, it's really terrible. He died when he was young. I think he was maybe 50 or 48. He was young I think he was killed in a car accident, if I'm not mistaken. A tremendous. I'll find that exchange during the break, where, if I can, online, where he interacts with Stein and he asks him one particular question about the laws of logic that it's just worth its weight in gold to hear. So I'll find it for you. So what Leah is saying here is a great question. She's saying, how do we justify that minor premise? How do we justify that objective moral values do exist? And that's what we're going to try and do now. So see if I am able to do so to your satisfaction. Yes? Great question. Basically, the question that you're asking is very much like the question that Anthony asked and Josh asked. And here again, we're having to make significant concessions in order to get to the place of interaction. In other words, we're going to concede, okay, you have a mind, because you can't go to someone who says, well, I believe, here again, that there is no God, but the torturing of children is wrong. You can't go and say, well, with all due respect, if you don't believe there's a God, you don't really have a mind, and so there's no point in discussing. You see what I'm saying? So we have to meet them where they're at. We, of course, know that they do possess a mind, but we know that the reason that they possess a mind, the reason that they possess this identity, this quality, this immaterial quality that everyone possesses, is because of a theistic universe. But that's the very point you're trying to make. Okay? So great question. Very good question. So then notice our conclusion would be, if our two premises are sound, then our conclusion stands. Therefore, God exists as the moral lawgiver. Okay? So let's see if we can justify this. There, right in your packet, if materialism is true, then morality cannot be anchored to anything greater than personal or community preference. Preference is what you'd write there. Okay, this is what we're talking about. Where do we moor morality? If materialism is true, then morality cannot be anchored to anything greater than personal or community preference. One community might decide that the torture, rape, and killing of children is allowable under certain circumstances, and another community might decide that it is not. Well, that would be the end of the story. What right would one community have to push their moral perspective on another? They could recommend their moral perspective to another community. They could advertise their moral perspective to another community, but they could not consistently tell that community that they, ought to adopt a moral perspective different from their currently held perspective. Making sense? So Ed could say to Ned, Ned, the way that I'm doing things is really great. Let me tell you what's so great about it. A, B, C, D. But then Ned could reply to Ed and say, well, I see that there are some advantages to what you're doing, but what we do is actually better than what you do because of A, B, C, D, and E. And at that point, Ed can advertise to Ned and recommend to Ned and vice versa, but you cannot have a situation in which Ned would be compelled necessarily to acquiesce to Ed's morality or vice versa. Okay? Because let me put it to you this way. If morality If morality is made by man, if it originated in man, it can be modified by man. If morality originated in man, then it can be modified by man. Make sense? Okay. And this would be the rock bottom fundament for any moral system in a materialist universe. Personal or cultural preference. Okay? Is it Ed's morality or Ned's morality? Okay? So let's continue on here. All moral standards, are we all there together, everyone? All moral standards in a non-theistic universe would be relative. Relative to time, place, culture, and personal or community preference. Okay, that's why the essay that we're going to read during our break is titled, Why I Am Not a Moral Relativist. Okay? Does this make sense? Manuel, are you with me? Okay. Now, by the way, let's be clear what this does not mean. This does not mean that all atheists and agnostics are necessarily immoral people. Right? Do we follow that? Doesn't mean that at all. In fact, there are, of course, many moral, upstanding citizens of all cultures who are either atheistic or agnostic. But here's the point. Their choice to be moral and upstanding, honest, etc., is a choice rooted entirely in personal preference. Does everyone understand that? In other words, we're not saying that all atheists are immoral, all agnostics are immoral. We're not saying that. There are many atheists with better morals than many Christians. Okay? Our point is a simpler one and a more fundamental one, and that is that their worldview cannot justify their morality beyond to a degree that it is anything beyond personal preference or personal choice. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, so you don't want to get into a debate with an atheist and say, well, you don't have any morals anyway. Well, he's going to she will justifiably take offense at that. Right? Because he or she may have outstanding morals. The question is not, can an atheist be moral? It's, can their system support morality? Make sense? I would just say that when an atheist is being moral, he or she is living outside of the logical parameters of his or her worldview. Okay? We're going to try and demonstrate that.
In other words,
Brandon.
they believe it themselves.
Yeah, that's right. I agree with that, Brandon. So we're at the top of the page here. Biblically based morality is not like this. Okay? It is anchored, now watch this, we're talking about where do we moor morality. Biblically based morality is anchored in the loving, just, where is it anchored? Character of God. Biblical morality is anchored in the loving, just character of God. God, as man's creator and redeemer, is qualified to establish and enforce absolute standards of moral behavior, both in deed and even in thought. God's standard of morality is expressed most powerfully in two revelations. Okay? Are we following this, everyone? God as creator and redeemer, as transcendent to humanity, outside of humanity, and the creator of humanity, and from the Christian perspective, the redeemer of humanity is uniquely qualified to say what ought be done and what ought not be done. And he does this in two ways. There are two great poles around which biblical morality orbits. And they are, number one, the law, especially the Ten Commandments. And number two, what? The life of Christ, especially the death and resurrection of Jesus. So, the law and the life of Jesus Christ. Those are the two great poles around which biblical morality orbit. Okay. The law, that should read the law there in your handout. You want to insert the word. The law is largely the negative perspective on morality. 8 of the 10 commandments are framed in the negative. Thou shalt not. You shall not do this behavior. Okay? Or you ought not. Exactly. That's exactly right. So the law is framed in the negative. Why do you think that might be? It's mostly framed in the negative. By the way, what are the 2 commandments that are framed in the positive? Remember the Sabbath day and honor your father and your mother. So you tell me, why might the Ten Commandments be largely framed in the negative? Yeah, you nailed it, Leah. You nailed it. Say it louder for us.
Because our tendency is towards doing the wrong thing.
That's exactly right, because our tendency is toward doing the wrong thing, doing the rebellious thing, and it makes sense that God would. Now, for example, even me, when I'm disciplining my children, or when I'm just being a parent to my children, if I give them 10 moral exhortations, the majority of those, maybe 80%, who knows, will be in the negative. Landon, don't do that. Landon, don't treat your brother that way. Landon, okay? But also I will say, Landon, thank you so much for coming right when Mom called you. So it's often positive, but it's usually negative. Okay? And that, I don't think that's because I'm a bad dad or my wife is a bad mother. I think it's just that my son's behavior tends toward rebellion, tends toward disobedience,